Welcome to the Bible Made Clear and our next discipleship class. So we have been moving through the design argument. This is part 3 of the design argument under number 3 as far as the 12 points. So we'll be under the third point that shows Christianity is true. And so we had talked about the design argument in the previous two. Now, prior to that, we talked about the cosmological argument. Again, that was in multiple parts to get through it. And so we should be able to finish up the design argument today. We had gone through information and messaging, and now we are to the discussion of evolution. Evolution is basically a mindless, intelligentless process that supposedly occurred. This is the Darwinian view. I know there are theistic evolutionists, but whether it's theistic or non-theistic, you still need evidence for evolution. And in order to make evolution theistic, in other words, in order to have God be the one behind evolution, two things need to occur, which have been discussed previous. Number one, you would have to compromise on the Bible. You would have to basically deconstruct Genesis and eliminate any literal understanding of what the Bible is actually saying. You could not read it in a normal way, as any writing would be read, and it would not be saying what it's saying. And there are other theological problems as we get into the New Testament, of course. But that would be number one. Number two, unless you were just going to say God did it and that he really becomes God of the gaps at that point, there's nothing scientific about it, because you would be saying that God had to avoid the natural processes that evolution uses and essentially leave no evidence for anybody. So as we look at this, there are two central arguments for evolution. This is the foundational pieces, and we need to remember that evolution is based on natural selection. Natural selection is the idea that you have the ability to survive within different environments, and the environments over time create or help create an adaptation within certain living systems, and those adaptations are supposed to develop upwardly so that they are actually adding information, which is not possible, into their DNA to help them develop and everything else. Obviously, Darwinian evolution cannot account for first life. It can't account for any life, really. It can only look at what is happening in the mechanism and essentially try to decide whether they think that it has any evidence in the mechanism to demonstrate any form of evolving from one species or actually body plan to another, which has never been seen, never been documented, never been discovered, has only been discussed and hoped for. But at this point, we need to remember that evolutionists tend to argue when they discuss evolution epistemologically. In other words, they argue from what they know. So they watch mutations, they look back in history and assume that there were certain adaptations that changed something from one species or one living system into an entirely another living system. And that's an assumption because there is no evidence towards it, which we'll see. But to argue epistemologically is to avoid the ontological question, which is the study of the nature of being. In other words, why something exists in the first place. Well, I can talk about evolution all day long, but I can never account for how it started, where it came from, or how the first life started. And I still don't have evidence for what is necessary in transitional forms and everything else to prove that one living system changed into another. Secondly, if I make that comparison to an automobile engine, obviously I can be a great mechanic, know the insides and outsides of an automobile engine, and we're talking an internal combustion engine, but there would be no internal combustion engine to learn and work on and epistemologically know if there wasn't Henry Ford, or it's actually somebody else who originally designed the internal combustion. But if we give Henry Ford the benefit of the doubt, if Henry Ford didn't create the engine, there would be no engine to learn. So I can't argue that Henry Ford doesn't exist because I know the engine real well. So we can't make the argument and the leap that because, I understand a lot about adaptation and living systems and all that, now God doesn't exist because I understand that. Because, like I said, you still have to make the jump from one to another, which would equate to the fact that, hey, the Volkswagen engine apparently over time, left to itself with enough time, ended up becoming a Ferrari engine. That's just not going to happen. And it doesn't happen in much more complicated living systems where there's life involved. There's no life to an internal combustion engine. So the two central arguments for evolution is, first of all, small adaptations lead to new species, micro to macroevolution. Microevolution is just modifications within a species. Macro is one to another, one species to another species. And similarities in structure, homology, and DNA are evidences of a common ancestor. In other words, because all the DNA and carbon-based life is, in a sense, arranged the same. It's got the same four-letter alphabet that it utilizes and everything else, then that means one thing had to have come from another. They're all connected in that way. The question is the connection the previous existing living system, or is the connection the creator that created them all with the same fingerprints? I think the answer is obvious. So first we'll look at the small adaptations to new species. So this is the mapping that talks about what Darwin discovered in his natural selection cyclical effect in the finches that were on Galapagos Islands. But what they've discovered actually since then is that it is cyclical and not directional. In other words, they go through a cycle depending upon the wet and dry times of the year. If these finches need to break nuts with their beaks in order to eat and survive, then the finches with the larger beaks end up being able to eat and survive during the times when there is the larger nuts that they need to be able to crack. During the other times, then smaller beaked finches can survive because they don't need the power of their beak in order to break the nuts to survive. So you start with finches and end with finches, but the origin of finches is never explained. It's survival, not arrival of the species that's discussed. Epistemologically, it's being talked about without, or actually with avoiding, the ontological question. So where did finches come from? Darwin had a view on survival of the species, but not on the arrival of the species, origins, right? Modifications within a species is not biological evolution. They're still finches. One thing is not changing into another. It is only showing modifications, which we all know take place, but that is not evolution in any way. So that's number one. Number two are the similarities in structure, homology. So let's take a look at that briefly. So evidence for macroevolution, does that exist? That's Richard Dawkins in the bottom right. And he says the reason we know for certain we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of the genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals. In other words, and this was him writing to Philip Johnson when asked the question. So apparently the view is that the similarity in the structure of DNA really is what means that we're all connected together. What about DNA similarity? So DNA similarity is about 96% between apes and humans, but also 90% between mice and humans. All right, so because of the complex ways cells use genetic information, very small genetic differences can produce big functional differences. So being close is not the same, and that's the key. So DNA similarity could be evidence of a common designer rather than a common ancestor. Similar structures often have a similar blueprint. And I think that's really the obvious connection, because we cannot find a directional connection from one to the next. The connection is in the mind of the interpreter, the scientist that is interpreting the data. It is not in the data itself. Darwinists must explain the vast dissimilarity between living things. The bee, the octopus, the Venus flytrap, mildew, the peacock, the porcupine, the human, etc. The burden is on the proof of the Darwinists to try to make these connections. It is certainly not on the creationists to try to disprove it, because there's the disproving is there by not ever making the case to prove it in the first place. So naturalist philosophy is disguised as science, which we will see here with Richard Dawkins. He says the reason we know for certain we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals, which we quoted. He goes on in that quote to say, my philosophical commitment to materialism and reductionism is true, but I would prefer to characterize it as a philosophical commitment to real explanation as opposed to complete lack of explanation is what you espouse. Talking, again, he's communicating with Philip Johnson. But the problem here is that he is assuming what he's trying to prove. So he's ruling out intelligence beforehand, in other words, begging the question, assuming what he's trying to prove. That is not science. That isn't even good philosophy, quite frankly. So this book's Signature in the Cell, talks about the structure of DNA and everything. If you're interested in going deeper on the DNA issue, this is a great resource by Stephen Meyer, and it's not really refutable as far as the evolutionary concept is concerned. Now, Einstein on science and philosophy said the man of science is a poor philosopher, because you have to have these logical connections philosophically. In other words, they have to be reasoned out in order for you to do proper science. Science requires philosophy. You have to be able to do philosophy first. In other words, if we call philosophy our reasoning process, we have to be able to reason out what we think is going to occur, or what we think possibly could occur in an experiment before doing the experiment. So if the experiment is actual science, then the philosophical aspect of it, which is a non-material thinking process that has no material aspect to it and cannot be put under a microscope or tested scientifically, that is the aspect of science that gets way beyond the material aspect. And when we come to philosophy and trying to reason things logically, scientists do not seem to have this as a strong foundation. They seem to understand data very well. They do their analysis to discover the data, but putting it together, there just seems to be too much bias, at least in many of the scientists today. Follow the evidence where it leads, and then that will get you where you need to go. Homology. Does similarity of structure prove a common ancestor? Well, you can see the different hands and feet up top or whatever, dog, bat, seal, and man, that does not mean that one came from the other. That doesn't even work in evolution. And again, down below, you get these drawings of the shark, the salamander, the chicken, the chimpanzee, and then you got man. And, it's not a logical progression. Now, again, the only connective point is in the mind of the interpreter here. So does similarity of structure prove that the pot evolved from the teaspoon? No, of course not. Just because they're similar doesn't mean that at all. Darwinist Tim Berra offered the progression of the Corvette as evidence of descent with modification. In other words, each one descended from the previous and it was modified and everything. The problem is that he actually proved the case for intelligent design. It's known as Berra's blunder because it is an illustration of intelligent design where intelligence was fused into the system to improve the Corvette over the years. It didn't just get there on its own. Now, science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. And Darwinists say that we know all of Earth's creatures share a common ancestor by way of unguided macroevolutionary processes because of DNA and homology. And how do we know that DNA and homology all point to a common ancestor rather than a common designer? Like, how do we know that it's one and not the other? Well, because macroevolution is true. But that's circular reasoning. Let's take a look. This is how their thinking works. How do you know evolution is true? Well, DNA and homology, which tells us we have a common ancestor. Why not a common designer? Well, because evolution is true. And then we're back to the beginning, which is what? Circular reasoning. This is begging the question, and that's how the cycle goes, unfortunately. And it's assuming what you're trying to prove. You assume one thing is true, so you just get the points together to prove that it's true, but that is not following the evidence. That is just following a circular argument, getting back to the beginning, because that's what you want to have true or assume is true. And if you assume it's true, then sure, all evidence is going to lead to it all the time.
So there's irreducibly complex aspects to biology that seems to prevent a gradual, non-intelligent process that brings forth new body plans.
So do you believe that things such as evolution were set in place by this higher power?
I think there's a lot of problems with macroevolution. Now, when you use the word evolution, you need to define your term.
Darwinian.
Okay, if you mean change over time, everybody agrees with that. Christians, non-Christians. If you mean microevolution, adaptation within a type, everybody agrees with that. But if you mean macroevolution, molecules to man without intelligence, I not only think the evidence is not there for that, I think there's evidence against it. For example, the fossil record is one piece of evidence against it. The Cambrian explosion shows every major phyla come into existence without fossil precursors. Number two, there's genetic limits to change, which appear to prohibit this kind of macroevolutionary change. I mean, breeders can't break genetic limits to change. Why should we expect non-intelligent processes to do so? There's something now known as epigenetic information, which is the structure of a cell which you can't modify by mutations, which shows that you could modify or mutate DNA from now till doomsday. You'll never get a new body plan. Why? Because DNA alone won't give you a new body plan. You need epigenetic information. This is all from Stephen Meyer's book, Darwin's Doubt, if you want to go further. There's irreducible complexity, which shows that it's very difficult, or it seems virtually impossible, to create these new body plans in gradual ways, because you need all of the body plan and all the parts together in one place at one time to have function. For example, you can't have flight in a bird if you only have half a wing. You won't even get flight if you have 90% of a wing. You need 100% of a wing. So how do you get flight in a bird if you only have half a wing? You don't. The creature wouldn't live if it only had half of a wing. So there's irreducibly complex aspects to biology that seems to prevent a gradual, non-intelligent process that brings forth new body plans. And all this is in stealing from God, and if you really want to get the depth for it, you need to go to Darwin's Doubt, which is Stephen Meyer's hernia-inducing volume about this big.
I think that pretty much explains it. I think Frank did a great job. And again, you know, this is the issue that we're dealing with here. Now, where is the evidence? So that's a copy of, or image of, Origin of the Species, and that's Darwin there. So let's see what he says. Darwin said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. That's page 334 in the 6th edition of Origin of the Species. He goes on, he says, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links, or what we would call transitional forms? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely granulated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. Now, obviously, Darwin expected, as time would go on beyond him, that these transitional forms would be discovered and make all the connective points that were necessary. Now, that never happened. So Stephen Gould, he used to be the paleontologist at Harvard. He has passed. He knows the fossil record does not support Darwinian evolution. He said the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology, right? They study the bones. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. So he thinks it's reasonable because he's an evolutionist and he believes that evolution occurred. He just knows that the evidence is not there. National Geographic, they came out with this, is Darwin wrong in 2004. They have a quote in there, illuminating but spotty, the fossil record is like a film of evolution from which 999 of every 1,000 frames have been lost on the cutting room floor. No connection. And this is the definition of spotty. I think it's more than spotty, right? What would be the fossil record? What would it look like if creation were true? So evolutionists to the rescue. So Stephen Gould co-authored a paper called Punctuated Equilibrium with Niles Eldredge in 1972. In this, they describe how living things didn't evolve as Darwin stated, but instead punctuated to the next evolutionary stage and left no evidence in the fossil record. So that's how it occurred. We're not looking for transitional forms anymore. We don't have to, because everything punctuated to the next level of life. This was their solution to the lack of transitional forms in the fossil record, because they knew that they were being criticized for a lack of transitional forms, which they admitted, and they knew they were paleontologists, but then they figured that this is really the solution, punctuated equilibrium. It is really, the question is it really sound science to create a non-observable, non-testable, non-existent explanation to offer support for the missing evidence of Darwinism? I mean, does that sound reasonable to you? Did Gould and Eldredge realize that the evidence for their theory was missing, just as the transitional forms are? I mean, think about that. So I'm creating a solution. We can't find transitional forms. So here's the evidence that things punctuated from one level to the next. They didn't leave any evidence. I mean, if you can sell that, you can sell ice to an Eskimo. I'm telling you, this is, there is just no way that this is even close to science. This is science or nonsense, as we would say. So macroevolution would like you to believe this, even according to Gould, right? However, macroevolutionary changes within types, yes, like various dogs, modifications, absolutely, right? Microevolutionary changes between types, no, that doesn't happen. This is the true picture that even Gould was referencing. You just have these things at the nodes. There's nothing connecting them. The rest is inference, right? There aren't missing links. There's a missing chain. There's a missing connection. Look for the links. There's no links. There's no connection. Nothing there. So the fossil record can establish ancestral relationships. It just can't. They don't exist. 99% of the biology of any organism resides in its soft anatomy, which is inaccessible in a fossil. That's a quote from Michael Denton. To take a line of fossils and claim that they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story, amusing perhaps, even instructive, but not scientific. That's Henry Gee, the chief science writer for Nature magazine. So, do you believe in evolution? Right? Here's a question for evolutionists if you want to ask them. What do you mean by evolution? We need to establish what evolution is, because there's a lot of times we're talking about evolution, evolutionary concepts, and if you're going to have a discussion with an evolutionist, the first question is, what do you mean by evolution? Because they could be talking macro, micro, or have a different version altogether. Then how did you come to that conclusion? And again, these questions are really out of Greg Koukl's Tactic book. He goes through and offers questions and things, but these are the most logical questions. What do you mean? Make people define their terms. And how do you come to that? What is your evidence for that, right? Then, when they have no evidence, have you ever considered? And then you give a solution that has evidence. This is communication. The other way is not, just kind of throwing things out and saying, this is true, that's true, and then ending the discussion. Have you ever considered, right, regarding change within organisms and environmental factors? The best evidence to date indicates that these factors are inadequate to drive full-scale macroevolution. Something else is required, intelligence. So this is out of William Dembski's Design Revolution. Answering the tough questions about intelligent design. And so regarding change within organisms, environmental factors still cannot produce these changes from one species or type to another. It's just not going to happen. You still need intelligence. Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge co-authored Punctuated Equilibrium. We went through that in 72, recognizing that there is no evidence for transitional forms in the fossil record. Therefore, they believe the lack of evidence means that species punctuated to the next level and left no trace. Conveniently, their evidence of evolution is not evidence. This is not science, but a story wrapped in technical language. Just kind of a recap. Now, this is why David said in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. The earth is uniquely positioned for all the world to clearly see the heavens. I would recommend that you watch The Privileged Planet. You can view it online through YouTube or whatever. You can watch the whole thing. It was done by the Discovery Institute, and it will show you how uniquely the Earth is positioned, not only within our solar system, but within our galaxy and within the rest of the universe, that we can observe and discover what's there. I think what people don't realize is most planets do not have that viewing to the rest of the universe. Again, we see that David said in Psalm 33, by the word of the Lord, the heavens were made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. And he went on, for he spoke, meaning God, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. Again, it's repeated in Psalm 148. Same thing. God spoke, and the universe came into being from nothing. This is what all scientific and philosophical evidence makes clear. There was nothing, and then there was something. And God is the only being capable of having that happen. Psalm 8, David said, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you visit him? So David understood this. David, though one of the ancients, was brilliant, also understood what he was looking at and the fact that it could not just happen on its own, but actually respected God and had the proper reverence for God, realizing that he was the creator. It is clear that God made the universe, and man in particular. He made the world habitable for man and located the earth in its unique position for man to be able to discover the same thing David did, no different. Isaiah went on to say, I am the Lord, or I am Jehovah, or Yahweh, who makes all things, who stretches out the heavens all alone, who spreads abroad the earth by myself. So very interesting. Astronomers discovered that the universe is expanding. Well, God is stretching it out. And Isaiah knew that 800 years ago. So the astronomers are starting to catch up. And Isaiah had no telescope, nothing but his eyes. And again, this is why Paul said in Romans 1, what may be known of God is manifest in them, that is all people, and the people that reject Christ. For God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. In other words, God is known by his effects, since we don't see him. We work from effect back to cause. This is what Romans 1 is saying. Romans 1 is saying that the invisible attributes of God are clearly seen in what he created. Going on, he says, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. His eternal power and Godhead talks about the power and capability for what we would call the cosmological argument, the Godhead being all the attributes of this divine being who existed prior to time, space, and matter, right? Timeless, spaceless, all-powerful, purposeful. He had intention, intelligence, and everything. That's all assumed within the concept of the Godhead. The Trinity, as a Christian teaching and doctrine in the New Testament, is developed. But the idea is that you have right here the cosmological argument. You have the design argument with intelligence in reference to the Godhead, and the design aspects referenced in the fact that the things that are seen, what we can observe, whether it's out in space or right here within the atmosphere that we live, that we can see the complexity and we can see the just everything following, the goal-directedness of everything that's made, following the law of causality, everything working together. We can discover how everything is laid out mathematically, not because we created math, it's because we discovered math, because the universe is laid out mathematically in that way. So that does not happen randomly or by accident or by chance. This is something, and Paul is bringing light to this issue because it is so obvious to the onlooker. He goes on to say those who suppress the truth in unrighteousness do so because that which may be known of God is manifest in them. In other words, man was created with the ability to reason from what is available back to God, right? From the effects we see back to the cause, right? That's what he's saying. For God has shown it to them, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. God is known by his acts or effects, the things that he does, what he's created, and on top of that, the recorded miracles that he has done and everything else, not to mention the miracle of the creation of the universe, that tells us about the Creator, and then we work back. Now, obviously, this is part of the New Testament that I'm quoting here, and the Old Testament from the Psalms and Isaiah, but these writers thousands of years ago recognized what is so obvious and seems to be escaping some of the more intelligent, either atheistic astronomers and evolutionary scientists today, in order to just avoid God's existence. And that's not intelligent, and that's not scientific at all. So, going on, he says, being understood by the things that are made, even as eternal power, God is powerful, the cosmological argument, to make and sustain the universe. As I mentioned in Godhead, God is intelligent, the design argument, so that they are without excuse. Man has to deny his senses, reason, logic to not deny God's existence. So, in summary, that the universe was created by a creator is evident no matter what technology is available for man for observation and discovery. To think the universe made itself or that there is no creator is a folly of human willful ignorance. What else could it be? This is why David said in Psalm 14 and 53, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Imagine the folly of declaring there is no God when it can be easily observed otherwise. And that is it. So this is the end of the design argument. Next step will be the moral argument for God. And that will sum up, after we do the moral argument, we'll sum up point 3. So until next time, may God richly bless you as you continue to study his word.